Well, hello and welcome to another Lanzarote Information. I'm Mike from Lanzarote Information, and today we're going to be talking about the Puerto del Carmen story. Now, you probably know Puerto del Carmen very well. You'll know it as a resort which has an extraordinarily wide range of accommodation, from very inexpensive little studio apartments to 2 and 3 key apartment complexes, to 3-star hotels, 4-star hotels, and these days a plethora of 5-star hotels. But of course it wasn't always like that, and today's video is about giving you the history of Puerto del Carmen and how it came about. Now, to understand that, we need to go back to the 1950s, and in the 1950s there was pretty much no tourism at all here in Lanzarote, and that was because people of Northern Europe didn't travel abroad for their holidays. You know, typically people who were going on holiday from the UK would go to Scarborough or Blackpool or Bournemouth. The people of Germany might go to the Black Forest. People who lived in France might go to the south of France and enjoy Nice, Cannes, or if they had a bit of money, Monte Carlo. And the reason they didn't travel abroad was because flying was super expensive, but it was also very, very slow. A Douglas DC-3, for example, flying from London to Lanzarote would take about 10 hours. And even flying to the south of Spain, you were looking at a 6 or 7 hour flight. And that just didn't really make it practical. But the advent of the jet age in the 1960s did make it practical, because now you were in a situation where people could fly to the Balearics or the south of Spain from the northernmost parts of Europe in only 2.5 hours. They could get to the Canaries in 4 hours. So that opened the opportunity for people to travel abroad and to do it relatively quickly and certainly more efficiently in terms of price than they could have done before that. The package holiday was born. So I think some enlightened people on this island and across the Canaries realised this represented an opportunity for the islands. But the problem in Lanzarote at that time, and let's fast forward now to the mid-60s, they could see this opportunity. They could provide the package holidays that everyone in Europe was looking for, because we had all the resources here. We had the sunshine, we had the wonderful beaches, we had the lovely warm ocean. What we didn't have was the hotels. And in 1965, there were only 2 hotels on the island. One was a fairly old and slightly run-down Parador, and the other was what was then the newly opened Hotel Lanzarote in Arrecife. And what it needed and what happened was that a particularly enlightened entrepreneur came along and decided where the island's first tourist resort should be, and that where the hotel that was going to open it and start it all off was going to be located. And his name was Don Virgilio Suarez. Now, I need to tell you about what we now know as Puerto del Carmen at the time, because it wasn't called Puerto del Carmen. In fact, all that was there was a small fishing village, and it was called La Tiñosa, and it was the fishing village of Tias. It was part of the municipality of Tias and controlled by the Ayuntamiento there. And La Tiñosa was basically just a small collection of houses and a rough and ready fishing port with a slipway that the fishermen could use to launch their vessels. Now, Don Virgilio decided it would be a great place to locate the first tourist resort on the island. And there were a number of reasons for this. The proximity to the fishing port was moderately interesting, but right next door to the fishing port was a very nice, safe, sheltered bay, which he thought was the perfect place to put a frontline property, giving people a view of the ocean and a beach right in front of the hotel. And he formed a company, ironically called Playa Blanca SA, White Beach SA, that's like a PLC company, got a group of investors together. They bought that plot of land, which was kind of next to what we now think of as the Old Town, and decided to build a quality hotel there, which they called the Fariones, which means lighthouse, so it's the Lighthouse Hotel. And the Fariones was opened in 1968 with 242 rooms, and it instantly doubled the number of hotel beds on the island from the old Lanzarote and the Parador. And what's interesting is that it's been through several refurbishments over the years. It's now a 5-star hotel, but it's kept its original character. It's kept the Manrique style swimming pool, the palms, the planting all leading down towards the ocean at the front of it, and it pretty much looks like it did then, although it's actually been changed in a number of ways since then. Now, it was tough going initially for Don Virgilio and the original group of investors, because in 1968 they opened this lovely hotel, they marketed it very hard, but Lanzarote wasn't even on anybody's maps. I mean, most people in Northern Europe had never heard of it. They might have had a vague idea of where the Canary Islands were, but specific islands, they just didn't know about them. So the early years were hard going. The company ran loss after loss, but after about 5 years, they suddenly reached a tipping point where the people they had managed to attract started coming back year after year. And that repeat custom was the foundation of the success of the Fariones. So we've now moved on to 1973, but bear in mind, the Fariones was like a little oasis. A decision was made to call the area Puerto del Carmen because it was felt that was just easier for people to say than La Tiñosa. Obviously the town was named after the patron saint of Tias, who is Carmen. And as I say, we all now know it as Puerto del Carmen, but it was still being referred to in 1973 as La Tiñosa. And as I said, the Fariones was just a little oasis. There was nothing else there. There was literally just a road that went from the airport to the Fariones and pretty much stopped when it got to La Tiñosa, the little fishing harbour. So we're in 1973. The hotel is doing well now. It's got very high occupancy. And of course, that encouraged another group of investors to come in and say, well, we'll do the same. Let's put another hotel up. But we'll go at the other end of this new town called Puerto del Carmen. And they created the San Antonio Hotel, which of course is still there now. So once that was built, we ended up with the situation where we had the Fariones at one end, the San Antonio at the other end, and nothing in between other than a road, which we now call the Strip, but the road at that time was called by its proper name, which is Avenida de las Playas, because it ran along the beaches between the two hotels. So it was time for the Ayuntamiento of Tias to step in, the town hall of Tias. And they got hold of Cesar Manrique, who had recently moved back to the island after a spell in New York. And they asked for his advice on what they should put between the two hotels. And he was quite heavily involved in the original planning for Puerto del Carmen. And what he designed was what we have now, basically, which was a series of commercial centres on the front of the road, the Avenida, and then going behind it, a series of accommodation apartment complexes, small apartments, larger apartments, going further back, duplex properties, and then right at the back of it, larger villas with private individual swimming pools. And he was the one who insisted that this should all be low rise, it should all be white, and the properties at the back, in his view, should have Lanzarote green woodwork on the windows and doors, and as they got to the front line of the sea, that should become blue. So there was a really intense period of construction from the late 70s and all through the 1980s to build these complexes, villas, apartments, duplexes, to provide this really broad breadth of accommodation offer that I talked about at the start of this video. By 1981, Don Virgilio and his original group of investors decided to sell the Fariones, and it was bought by the Rosa family, headed up by Juan Francisco Rosa. And he still owns the hotel. He's recently done a full refurbishment on it. And he also owns the Princesa Yaiza and Finca de Uga and all kinds of properties across the island. So at that point, he became a big investor in Puerto del Carmen and the future of Puerto del Carmen. Now, the first tourists who really discovered Lanzarote and therefore Puerto del Carmen were the Germans. And it really took off with German tourism in the 1980s. Lanzarote became the place for German visitors to come. And that legacy very much remained when we moved here 25 years ago. A lot of the tourists coming to the island, the highest percentage were German. As you walked around Puerto del Carmen, you would see, like you see nowadays, menus in Spanish and English. In those days, they would be in Spanish and German. A lot of the signage, where it would say car hire in English, it would say the word for car hire in German, which I think is Autovermietung. I can't remember the right word, but look it up, Google it if you want to know what it is. And they were followed by the Scandinavians, who also started coming in their droves. So, all of those bars and businesses in the commercial centres along the front reflected the people who were coming. So, where now you see sort of British bar, curry shop, Irish bar, in those days you would see German bar, French restaurant, Norwegian restaurant. So it was a very different mixture. But inevitably those businesses change according to the market. And I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying it's a fact of life that these things change over time. And these days, far and away, our biggest number of visitors come from the UK, and Ireland is in second place currently. So we get to the early 90s now, and the whole area between the two hotels has pretty much been developed. It's looking mature, it's looking lovely. Most of the properties, if not all of them, have been sold to individuals who are either living in them or using them as holiday homes and renting them out. A kind of strange thing happened at that point because up until now, the original fishing harbour of La Tiñosa hadn't really been touched. It had just been left as it was. And it consisted of that original small harbour with the slipway, and there was a place you could go and buy your fish from the fishermen as they came ashore, and there was one small restaurant down there. And it was decided to redevelop that area, and it became known as the Old Town. And it's kind of weird because there are almost no buildings left of the original Old Town. It was actually all newly built, so all those apartment complexes in what we now call the Old Town were built after the New Town. The harbour area with the restaurants sort of all going around that stage area, and the ones at higher level going along, joining on to the promenade, were built after the New Town, although we all call them part of the Old Town. At the same time, La Tiñosa, the little harbour bit there, was also enlarged to make it more user-friendly and to attract pleasure boats to moor in there, because at that time there were no marinas on the island. So apart from that harbour and the small ones at Famara and around the corner at La Santa, there weren't really places that people could safely moor their boats. So that kind of brings us up to date, because today we have basically what you see is what had been created by the mid-1990s. For sure, some buildings are brought down, many more have been refurbished over the years, but essentially that original vision of Manrique and the Ayuntamiento de Tías still remains in place, and it's an accurate reflection of what they envisaged when they had those early conversations in the 1970s. Today, Puerto del Carmen remains not just the first resort on the island, but also the busiest resort on the island. And it's very much the powerhouse of Lanzarote's tourism economy. Around 40% of all visitors coming to the island stay in the resort of Puerto del Carmen. Playa Blanca has been catching it up for years now and is sitting at 30% currently, but Puerto del Carmen remains most people's number one. Now, I'll tell you a little interesting aside here. I'm going to take you back to the 1960s when Don Virgilio came along and decided he was going to form a company to build a hotel in Puerto del Carmen. There was a tourism plan which kicked off just before that, a few years before that happened. And the aim of that one was to turn Famara into the island's premier resort. And the thing that put paid to that plan was Don Virgilio coming along with his investors and their suitcases full of money and deciding that no, they wanted the tourist resort that they were going to be a part of, that they were going to invest in, to be in Puerto del Carmen, largely because it was a relatively short transfer from the airport. So just think, if he hadn't come along, I could be sitting here today telling you the Famara story, which is an interesting one, but it never developed into the massive tourist resort that a lot of people saw in the early 60s. So there you go, that's the Puerto del Carmen story. Have you found that interesting? I'd be really curious to know if there was stuff in there you didn't already know. More importantly, I'm really interested to know if you find these sort of things interesting. And if you do, if you don't, leave a comment below and let me know. Because, I'm always looking for ideas to do new things. My thoughts at the moment are that if you like this one, I'll do the same for Costa Teguise. I'll do the same for Playa Blanca, and just, tell the story of these places and how they started, how they've evolved over the years and where we've got to with them now. So leave me a comment, let me know what you think. And if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please do so. We produce 3 videos a week, a Tuesday one like this, a Thursday one, which is always a walkabout somewhere on the island, and of course the Saturday news, which is the most popular one with all of our viewers. Thanks so much for watching. Bye for now, everyone. Bye.